Here's Richard Swinburne to make some goofy arguments about the soul.
You like to think of persons as more than merely material.
Yes, I think that's a much wider term. I mean, persons includes humans, but it's a much wider term, and I would define it as a pure mental substance. I'll give you a definition of that in a moment. A pure mental substance who has free will and moral beliefs and certain powers to make a difference to things. And that is compatible with them either having a body or not having a body. I understand by a pure mental substance one for whose existence nothing material is necessary.
What does it mean for a person to exist without consisting of anything material? It seems to me like a person is a pattern of material activity. Personhood is a kind of software running on some material substrate. I don't understand what it would mean for a person to be anything other than that.
What I wanted to ask you about is one of the first problems that people encounter when considering persons as being material and also partly immaterial, which is the problem of interaction between these two parts of the human being. It seems that if I were to prod your brain in various ways, it affects the mind. And similarly, it seems impossible for the mind to change or do anything in any way without the brain also doing something. So this leads a lot of people to think that the mind and the brain are just the same thing. What is it that allows us to separate these out and to explain how they could possibly interact if one is material and one is not?
At the most fundamental level, we might not completely understand how physical things interact with other physical things. However, what bothers me about the idea that there is a non-physical mind which interacts with a physical brain is the arbitrariness of what minds, if we conceive of them as non-physical things, seem to be able to interact with. Minds don't seem to be able to interact with just anything physical. If they exist independent of physical things, they seem only to be able to interact with very particular physical things. Each person's putatively non-physical mind seems to be able to interact only with that person's own brain. A person's mind seems not to be able to interact with anything else. We don't seem to be able to move objects outside of our bodies, and we don't even seem to be able to move our own body parts if they become physically disconnected from our brains. If our spinal cords are severed, we lose control of our own limbs. If non-physical minds can interact with matter, why can they only interact with brain matter? And if they can control brain matter, why can each person's mind only control their own brain and not other people's brains? What is special about brains that allows them to be unique among material objects with respect to being susceptible to the control of non-physical minds? And how is it that each brain is only susceptible to the control of only one particular non-physical mind and not other non-physical minds? It seems much more parsimonious to infer that it's just the brain doing all the work.
It certainly doesn't follow from the fact that one makes a difference to the other, and conversely, that they must be the same thing. That's quite a further question. So your question is, how can they interact? And I'm just saying, well, it's a basic truth that they do interact, and I can show you that.
This is not an explanation. It's merely dismissing the problem of how they interact by simply stating that, well, they just do. In physics, we can observe four fundamental interactions: gravity, electromagnetism, and the weak and strong nuclear interactions. We do not observe any interaction between physical and non-physical entities because we don't seem to observe non-physical entities at all.
By saying that if you stick a pin into me, I feel pain. And pain is a mental property, a pure mental property, in the sense that it is one to which the subject has direct experience and necessarily is better placed to know about than anyone else. I can know whether I'm in pain better than you can.
I don't understand how that makes pain necessarily non-physical. The mere fact that there is a dichotomy between first-person experiences of phenomena and third-person experiences of phenomena doesn't mean that they are necessarily distinct phenomena.
And that's a necessary truth. It wouldn't be my pain if you could know about it better than I can. It wouldn't be a pain at all.
But what if some third-person observation, like a brain scan for example, allowed someone to know about your pain as well as you can?
If they settled down and thought about it, they would realize that there were properties to which the subject has privileged access, and properties which are publicly accessible. All physical properties are publicly accessible.
I don't see why properties that are only privately accessible cannot also be physical. It seems like the only way properties which are only privately accessible can only be considered non-physical is if they are arbitrarily defined as such. I see no reason why they can't be a simply different aspect of the same physical event.
Let's start with the issue of personal identity. Personal identity is the problem, or I am the same person as a certain person who has got a degree at Oxford in the 50s.
The problem of personal identity doesn't seem to me to be meaningfully distinct from the problem of identity generally. Both are made confusing by the Ship of Theseus problem. This is a thought experiment which asks you to imagine that a ship has a few parts replaced. Is it then the same ship? Well, what if it has half of its parts replaced? Or maybe 51% of its parts replaced? Is it the same ship then? At what point does it become a different ship? I don't think there is a definite answer to this. I believe that the existentialists are right. Identities are bestowed upon things to serve the purposes of the bestower. They are not something inherent to anything, even ourselves.
Most people would agree with that. And the issue is, what makes me the same person? And this is the question of personal identity. Well, the obvious answer is, because most people, well, same body. I've got the same body. But then I ask, well, how much of the same body? If I have a heart transplant, am I the same person? If I lose my legs and I'm given artificial ones, am I the same person? I don't think people would doubt that. And indeed, they'd only doubt whether I was the same person if some of my brain had been tampered with.
I see a person as analogous to software. Software is a pattern of physical activity carried out by a computer. It is physical regardless of which particular physical matter is running it. If you run software on one computer, then download it onto a different computer, it is still the same software. The same is true of the mind or of personhood. If you transfer a pattern of brain activity from one brain to another, then assuming the second brain carries out the same processes as the previous one, you have the same person or the same mind in the second brain as you had in the first. It is the pattern of activity that matters. The physical substrate is irrelevant, and no non-physical substrate, such as a soul, is necessary.
And the reason for that is that all our conscious thoughts depend on our brain. All our mental properties depend on our brain. Okay, so the next suggestion is I'm the same person if I have the same brain. But the same question arises again, how much of the same brain?
No, you don't need to have the same brain any more than Windows needs to be running on the same computer to still be Windows.
And, well, some people have quite large bits of the brain taken out, and they're said to be the same person. So how much of the same brain? And this question comes very acutely to our notice with the following interesting physiological discovery. The brain is the organ of consciousness, but it's the upper part of the brain, the cortex, that consciousness depends on.
If consciousness were ultimately non-physical, why would it depend on any part of the brain at all? If minds exist independent of brains, then why do we even have brains? What purpose do they serve if the mind is something distinct from them?
Suppose there are three people, let's say they're triplets, identical. And we call one of them Alexandra, the middle one, and we call the left one Alex, and we call the right one Sandra. Now, suppose we take out of Alexandra's brain both of the hemispheres, both the left and the right, and we put one into Alex's brain and the other into Sandra's brain. And suppose we then take out their other hemisphere, the one they were left with, and as we've seen, one hemisphere is enough. Now, each of them would claim to be Alexandra. That's all the memories they would have access to, and so on and so on. But they can't both be Alexandra. They have different thoughts and feelings and go out of the room by different doors and never see each other again.
Okay, so we've taken two bodies, completely removed their brains, then replaced each of those brains with one of the two hemispheres of a third person's brain. It seems to me that whether you consider the two people to be two versions of Alexandra or distinct persons, both going by the name Alexandra, is arbitrary. If we insist that only one of them is really Alexandra, and the one which is really Alexandra is the one with Alexandra's soul, then does that mean that the other has no soul at all? The idea that a person can exist without having a soul has interesting theological implications. Or if the other one does have a soul, where did that soul come from? Did the surgeon create the soul by carrying out the hemispherectomy?
So there are only three possibilities of what has happened here. The first is that the left-hand one, Alex, is Alexandra. The second is that the right-hand one is Alexandra. Sandra is Alexandra. And the third is that neither of them are.
I think we can also consider both of them to be Alexandra, just different versions of Alexandra.
And there is no conceivable experiment which could show which is the case. Yet this is not a matter of evolution. That is to say, if somebody is having an operation, on their brain, they want to know if they will survive. And the neuroscientist may be able to say, well, certainly there will be a surviving person who has most of your body. Yes, but says the prospective patient, I want to know if it'll be me. And unless there's a correct philosophical answer to that question, they won't know.
If we separate two hemispheres of Alexandra's brain and stick each hemisphere into a distinct body, then I don't see the problem with telling Alexandra that she will survive in two distinct parts. Swinburne seems to think that both people cannot be Alexandra, but I don't see why not.
So the issue is what makes one of them me, and nobody knows the answer. But there must be some difference that makes one of them me, and by making one of them me, I don't mean causes them to be me, but constitutes being me.
So if what constitutes being you is the soul, would the person with one hemisphere continue to carry the soul while the person with the other hemisphere is walking around without any soul at all? Would the hemispherectomy have created a distinct soul? The idea of the soul seems to raise a lot more questions than it answers.
And analytical philosophers have produced various ideas. They've said, well, it's me if it has, forget that particular example, but this is a general theory of what makes a subsequent person me. Subsequent person if it has most of the brain, or subsequent person if it has most of the memories and character. But the problem with these suggestions is, when you spell them out, they're extremely arbitrary.
Yeah, but that's true of the identity of anything. With the ship of Theseus, if you say that it's the same ship as long as no more than 50% of it is replaced, that's arbitrary too. That doesn't mean that the ship must therefore have some immaterial identity.
To spell them out, they would have to say something, well, something's me if it's got 52% of my brain, but not if it has 51. And that is silly. Being me can't consist in that. And if it could, you wouldn't know that it could. And likewise, you can't have a memory criterion. You can't say it's me if it has most of the previous memories. Nor, even if you combine these criteria, the same applies. But there must be something that makes me me. And since it's not a physical thing, in other words, part of the brain, and since it's not a property, such as either the physical properties of sight and so on, or the mental properties of thought, it must be something else. And since both mental properties and physical properties are ruled out, and physical substance is ruled out, it must be a mental substance.
Again, you can make the same argument about the identity of literally anything. You could say that since there must be something that makes the ship of Theseus, which, by the way, is an unsupported claim, and since it isn't anything material, the ship of Theseus must have some immaterial substance.
It must be something indivisible and non-material, which makes me me, and that's what I call the soul. If there weren't any soul, there wouldn't be a truth about whether a later person was me or not.
I would say that there is not, in fact, any objective truth about anything or anyone's identity. I would say that with our own identities and with the identities of anything else, we actually have a choice of truths. We get to choose which properties we want to consider essential to our identities, just as we get to choose which properties are essential to the identity of anything else. A clear illustration of this is the fact that astronomers decided to change what properties they wanted to regard as essential to a planet. Pluto used to be a planet, and now it's not. The reason why is not because anything new was discovered about Pluto, nor was it because anything new was discovered about the nature of planets. It was purely based on preference. That's why the International Astronomical Union put it to a vote. They literally just asked astronomers what they wanted a planet to be, and a majority, but not a unanimity, wanted to change the definition of a planet to a set of properties that Pluto did not have. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.